Welcome to J is for Justice podcast. If live breaking news and following true crime is your thing, then please consider subscribing to my channel. And if you like what you see in my videos, please consider giving them a thumbs up. Happy Saturday! Thank you for joining me on a Saturday stream. So thanks for being here. We're going to be talking about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, not with an I, but with an A. So we're going to start from the beginning. We're going to start with Ted Kaczynski's beginning. He was a very smart young man. He went on to Harvard at 16 years old. That's how smart he was. During his sophomore year at Harvard in 1959, he was recruited for a psychological experiment that at the time he didn't know would last 3 years. This experiment involved psychological torment and humiliation. And a lot of these excerpts that I'm going to be reading come from the book Mind Wars, Brain Research and the Military in the 21st Century. And that is by Jonathan D. Marino, Ph.D. So a lot of these quotes are going to be from that book, just to let you guys know. The Harvard study aimed at psychic deconstruction by humiliating undergraduates and therefore causing them to experience severe stress. Kaczynski's anti-technological fixation and his critical self had some roots in the Harvard curriculum, which emphasized the supposed objectivity of science compared with the subjectivity of ethics. Before his arrest, he demanded that the Washington Post and the New York Times publish a 35,000-word manifesto, and he called that manifesto The Industrial Society and Its Future. And it expressed all of Ted's views of science, culture, and what technology is going to bring us in the future. And he believed that the Industrial Revolution was like human enslavement. Like we were going to be slaves to technology. And this is a quote from Ted. He said, "The system does not and cannot exist to satisfy human needs. Instead, it is human behavior that has to be modified to fit the needs of the system. The only way out is to destroy the fruits of industrialization and promote the return of wild nature, in spite of the potentially negative consequences of doing so." After Harvard, Kaczynski earned his PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. I had no idea he went to U of M. Crazy. I'm from Michigan. Weird, right, Robin? Oh, man. Okay, so then he taught briefly at the University of California, Berkeley. After that was when he dropped out of society. For 18 years, he made homemade bombs and terrorized those he viewed as agents of anti-human technology. Can you imagine what he thought of Elon Musk? I wish someone would have interviewed this man before he died. People with brains like his who went through that era, we won't get them back. Like we just won't get them back. And it's sad. For that, it's very sad. And to be honest with you, I find Ted Kaczynski's life traumatic. I think it's awful. I think it's unfortunate. So anyways, after going off the grid, he moved into a Montana cabin in 1996. Or when he was arrested in 1996, he was in a remote Montana cabin. The man who conducted the humiliation experiment was the brilliant and complex Harvard psychologist, Henry Murray. Henry Murray was one of the most important scientists of his day, the pioneer of personality tests that are now a routine part of industrial management and psychological assessments. It is not too much to say that contemporary psychology would be far different without his contributions. So then this guy who wrote this book, he has in this article, he has a full disclosure. Murray was a close friend and colleague of his father's but he says they knew nothing of this experiment. So this dude who wrote this book, his dad and him were friends with Henry Murray. Henry Murray was a native of New York who became a Boston Brahmin. He attended the finest schools, Groton and Harvard, and earned an MD from Columbia and a doctorate in biochemistry from Cambridge University. He dropped medicine and natural science for psychology after reading Carl Jung, publishing a landmark work in 1938 called Explorations in Personality. Before World War II, this is where it gets interesting, the U.S. government asked him to do a psychological profile of Hitler, and during the war, he helped the Office of Strategic Services, later to become the CIA. So before it was the CIA, it was the Office of Strategic Services to assess its agents. In the 1950s, Murray's personality test, it's now called the TAT, was used to screen Harvard students. What? What? Can you believe this crap?
What?
They knew the smartest of the smart was coming into Harvard. So here we go. And yet another odd twist that shows why history is stranger than fiction. While Kaczynski was undergoing those humiliation experiments, a young Harvard researcher named Timothy Leary was beginning his research career on psychedelics. In 1960, Leary returned from a vacation in Mexico with a suitcase full of magic mushrooms. Murray himself is said to have supervised psychoactive drug experiments, including Leary's. According to Alston Chase, author of Harvard and the Unabomber, Leary called Murray, quote, the wizard of personality assessment, who, as OSS chief psychologist, had monitored military experiments on brainwashing and sodium amytal interrogation. I need some Twilight Zone music now. Oh my God. What? Oh, shoot. So that is our first little excerpt on, the background of Theodore. Let me come to chat and see what you guys are thinking so far, because I just, did these parents who were sending their children to Harvard, were they knowing this? This was the reason for these tests? It was probably just, basic tests. Oh, I forgot my background music. It was probably just basic tests to get entry into Harvard, which is absolutely nuts. Would have been probably nice to know that, right? So we're going to find out more about those experiments. Let me pull my document up. Hold on. I just feel like if people knew the truth about some of these things, or the background, I guess, maybe not even the truth, because we know he did what he did, but maybe if people knew the background of these situations, there wouldn't, really be so much hate, I guess. We were told that this guy was just a deranged lunatic. And as he may have been at that time, what was he before that? He was very smart, right? Look at this photo of him. This is what he looked like before the Harvard experiment. That was him as a young man. Now, if you want my honest opinion, we got 64 people here watching. If I had Idaho 4, there'd be 300-400 people here. This is why people don't know these things. This is why the majority of people don't know these things. Perfect example right there. All right, let's move on. Let's learn more about the experiments that were done on him. And I'm wondering, who are the other students and where are they? Are any of those other students perhaps, have they done bad stuff, or did they turn out normal? I mean, I just think that there should be some follow-up on this, maybe. Okay, here we go. And this is coming from The Guardian, okay? In 1958, a brilliant but socially inept 15-year-old began his studies at Harvard. Like many of his peers, he volunteered for a number of personality tests in return for a small fee. So that's how this was done. Only these were no ordinary tests, and the student was Ted Kaczynski, now better known as the Unabomber. This guy wrote, he was a Harvard student at the same time. So this guy wrote with Ted Kaczynski, and he started corresponding with him in the late 90s, and I think it was 1998. And that was when he first heard of the Murray experiment, and that's what Ted himself called it. So Ted had begun corresponding with this reporter in July of this author in 1998. And it was a few months after the federal court in Sacramento, California, sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. He hinted darkly that the Murray Center seemed to feel it had something to hide. One of his defense investigators, he said, reported that the center had told participating psychologists not to talk with his defense team. Through research at the Murray Center and the Harvard archives, this man found that, among its other purposes, Henry Murray's experiment was intended to measure how people react under stress. Murray subjected his unwitting students, including Kaczynski, to intensive interrogation, what Murray himself called vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks, assaulting his subjects' egos and most cherished ideals and beliefs. My quest was specific, to determine what effects, if any, the experiment may have had on Kaczynski. Kaczynski was accepted by Harvard in the spring of 1958. He was not yet 16 years old. One friend remembers urging Kaczynski's father, Turk, not to let the boy go, arguing he's too young, too immature, and Harvard is too impersonal. But Turk wouldn't listen. He said Ted's going to Harvard was an ego trip for him. Murray, a wealthy and blue-blooded New Yorker, was a scientist and a humanist. Before the war, he had been the director of the Harvard Psychological Clinic. And then we went over, he was the forerunner of the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. And he was doing these testings and monitoring military experiments on brainwashing. After the war, Murray returned to Harvard, where he continued to refine techniques of personality assessment. By 1950, he had resumed studies on Harvard undergrads. Before the war, he had started those, and it was called Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men. Why would they need to do this, you guys? The experiment in which Kaczynski participated was the last and most elaborate of these. In their post-war form, these experiments focused on stressful interpersonal relations, designing confrontations akin to those mock interrogations he had helped to orchestrate for the OSS. Kaczynski has said that he was pressured into participating. His hesitation turned out to be sensible. Researchers gave the volunteers almost no information about the experiment in which they would participate. Each was simply asked to answer yes to the following question. Would you be willing to contribute to the solution of certain psychological problems, part of an ongoing program of research in the development of personality, by serving as a subject in a series of experiments or taking a number of tests, average about 2 hours a week through the academic year at the current college rate per hour? That was the only question asked. In fact, it would never be clear what the certain psychological problems were, and the tests that served as the centerpiece for the undertaking appears remarkably similar to the old OSS stress test. Students would be given the third degree, but whereas the OSS applicants must have known that enduring unpleasant interrogations would be part of their job, these students did not. The intent was to catch them by surprise, deceive them, and to brutalize them. The students were led to believe that they would debate their philosophy of life with another student like themselves. In fact, they were confronted by a well-prepared stooge, a lawyer. When the subject arrived, he was escorted to a brilliantly lighted room and seated in front of a one-way mirror. A motion picture camera recorded his every move and facial expression through a hole in the wall. This sounds like something out of the Twilight Zone. Is this real? Is this real? Electrodes leading to machines that recorded his heart and respiratory rates were attached to his body. Forrest Robinson, the author of a biography of Murray, has described what happened next. As instructed, the unwitting subject attempted to represent and defend his personal philosophy of life. Invariably, however, he was frustrated and finally brought to expressions of real anger by the withering assault of his older, more sophisticated opponent, while fluctuations in the subject's pulse and respiration were measured. Not surprisingly, most participants found this highly unpleasant, even traumatic. We were led into the room with very bright lights. Very bright. One of them, codenamed Kringle, recalled afterwards. I had a sensation somewhat akin to someone being strapped on the electric chair with these electrodes. I really started getting hit really hard. Wham, wham, wham. And me getting hotter and more irritated and my heartbeat going up and sweating terribly. Right away, said another, codenamed Trump. Can't make it up. Can't make it up. Describing his experience afterwards, said, I didn't like the interrogator. Dr. G came waltzing over and put on those electrodes, but in that process, while he was doing that, kind of whistling. And then Mr. R, who was bubbling over, dancing around, started to talk to me about he liked my suit. The buzzer would ring or something like that. We were supposed to begin. He was being sarcastic or pretty much of a wise guy. And the first thing that entered my mind was to get up and ask him outside immediately. But that was out of the question because the electrodes and the movie and all that. I kind of sat there and began to fume. And then he went on and he got my goat and I couldn't think of what to say. And then they came along and they took my electrodes off. Codenamed Trump, eh? During the last year of the experiment, Murray made the students available to his graduate student assistants to serve as guinea pigs for their own research projects. Wow. By graduation, as Kenneth Keniston, one of the researchers, summarized the process later, he said, quote, each student had approximately 200 hours in the research and had provided hundreds of pages of information about himself, his beliefs, his past life, his family, his college life, development, fantasies, and hopes and dreams. Why were the students willing to endure this ongoing stress and probing into their private lives? Some who had assisted Murray in the experiment confessed that they had wondered this themselves, but they can only speculate that some of the students, including Kaczynski, did it for the money. That some, again, probably including Kaczynski, had doubts about their own psychic health and were seeking reassurance about it. That some, suffering from Harvard's well-known anatomy, were lonely and needed someone to talk to, and that simply had an interest in helping advance scientific knowledge. But in truth, we don't know. A former research associate of Murray, who has long been bothered about the unethical dimension of this study, told this author, later, I thought, we took and used them, and what did we give them in return? What was the purpose of the experiment? Murray gave himself curiously equivocal answers. Sometimes he suggested that his research might not have no value at all. As the data stand, there are nothing but raw data, meaningless as such, and the question is what meaning, what intellectual news can be extracted from them. In another context, he asked, are the costs in man-made hours incurred by our elaborate multiple procedures far greater than any possible gains in knowledge? Sounds like this guy was a little loopy. Murray. It is clear that Murray's experiment deeply affected at least some of its subjects. Even 25 years later, some recalled the unpleasantness. In 1987, Kringle remembered the anger and embarrassment, the glass partition, the electrodes, and wires running up our sleeves. 25 years later, Drill, another guy named Drill, still had very vivid general memories of the experience. He said, I remember someone putting electrodes and blood pressure counter on my arm just before filming. I was startled by my interlocutor's venom. I remember responding with unabating rage. And then 25 years later, Locust wrote, I remember appearing one afternoon for a debate and being hooked up to electrodes and sat in a chair with bright lights and being told a movie was being made. I remember him attacking me, even insulting me for my values or for my opinions I just expressed in my written material. I remember being shocked by the severity of the attack. I remember feeling helpless to respond. What is the point of this? They have deceived me, telling me there was going to be a discussion when in fact there was an attack. We don't know what effect this experiment may have had on Kaczynski. No one has had access to his records. But he certainly could have been one of the most vulnerable of Murray's experimental subjects, a point that the researchers seem to have missed. He was among the youngest and the poorest of the group. He also may have come from a dysfunctional home. As his college life continued, outwardly, Kaczynski seemed to be adjusting to Harvard, but inwardly, he increasingly seethed. According to Sally Johnson, the forensic psychologist who examined Kaczynski, he began worrying about his health. He began having terrible nightmares. He started having fantasies about taking revenge against a society he increasingly viewed as an evil force, obsessed with imposing conformism through psychological controls. These thoughts upset Kaczynski all the more because they exposed his ineffectuality. Johnson reported that he would become horribly angry with himself because he could not express this openly. Quote, I never attempted to put any such fantasies into effect because I was too strongly conditioned against any defiance of authority. I could not have committed a crime of revenge, even a relatively minor crime, because my fear of being caught and punished was all out of proportion to the actual danger of getting caught, end quote. Kaczynski felt that justice demanded that he take revenge on society, but he lacked the personal resources to do so. He had always been a good boy. Instead, he would seek escape. He began to dream about breaking away from society and living a primitive life. According to Johnson, he began to study information about wild edible plants and to spend time learning about the wilderness. And like many American intellectuals before him, he began to form a plan to seek personal renewal in nature. Today, society would not tolerate the deceptions of the Murray experiments, but different standards prevailed then, and its ethics were definitely acceptable in their day, but the ethics were wrong. And they framed Kaczynski's first encounter with a reckless scientific value system that elevated the pursuit of scientific truth above human rights. When soon after Kaczynski began to worry about the possibility of mind control, he was not giving vent to paranoid delusions. In view of Murray's experiment, he was not only rational but right. The university and the psychiatric establishment that had been willing accomplices in an experiment that had treated human beings as guinea pigs and had treated them brutally. Here is a powerful logical foundation for Kaczynski's laterally expressed conviction that academics, in particular scientists, were thoroughly compromised servants of the system, employed in the development of techniques for the behavioral control of populations. It was the confluence of two streams of development that transformed Kaczynski into the Unabomber. One was personal, fed by his anger towards his family and those he felt had slighted or hurt him in high school and in college. The other derived from his philosophical critique of society and its institutions, and reflected the culture of despair he encountered at Harvard and later. The Murray experiment, containing both psychological and philosophical components, may well have fed both streams. I hope you enjoyed that article because that I found absolutely fascinating and sad all at the same time. Because you know what? He deserved better. He deserved better. He was so smart. I mean, 15 years old and his father shoos him off to Harvard in the hands of these men to just do these experiments on his boy. And yeah, craziness. I know, wouldn't that have been great to hear what he thought of Elon? What he thought of AI and all that. I mean, he was ahead of his time. His manifesto is super, super long, but I'm going to read you guys a couple quotes from him, from the manifesto, because they're pretty powerful. I know you might have to go back and replay him because he's so smart. Like, I have to really focus when I read some of his quotes because they are so intellectual. But this one here is about pharmaceutical drugs and depression, things like that. And he says, I quote, "Imagine a society that subjects people to conditions that make them terribly unhappy, then gives them the drugs to take away their unhappiness. Science fiction. It is already happening to some extent in our own society. Instead of removing the conditions that make people depressed, modern society gives them antidepressant drugs. In effect, antidepressants are a means of modifying an individual's internal state in such a way to enable him to tolerate social conditions that he would otherwise find intolerable." True. That one's very, very, I can't agree more with that. Craziness. All right, here's another one. Those who are most sensitive about politically incorrect terminology are not the average black ghetto dweller, Asian immigrant, abused woman, or disabled person, but a minority of activists, many of whom who do not even belong to any oppressed group, but come from privileged strata of society. Is he not right? Who do you always hear talking about being politically correct? This dude was a genius and they ruined him. And they put him in 23-1 for decades. For decades. Here's another one. History is made by active, determined minorities, not by the majority, which seldom has a clear and consistent idea of what it really wants. Let's see. I'm going to find one about technology. Here's one about mental health. The concept of, quote, mental health in our society is defined largely by the extent to which an individual behaves in accord with the needs of the system and does so without showing signs of stress. This is pretty long, but let's read this one. This one's about activism and leftists. He says, leftists may claim that their activism is motivated by compassion or by moral principles. And moral principle does play a role for the leftists of the over-socialized type. But compassion and moral principle cannot be the main motives for leftist activism. Hostility is too prominent a component of leftist behavior. So is the drive for power. Moreover, much leftist behavior is not rationally calculated to be of benefit to the people whom the leftists claim they are trying to help. For example, if one believes that affirmative action is good for black people, does it make sense to demand affirmative action in hostile or dogmatic terms? Obviously, it would be more productive to take a diplomatic approach that would make at least verbal and symbolic concessions to white people who think that affirmative action discriminates against them. But leftist activists do not take such an approach because it would not satisfy their emotional needs. Helping black people is not their real goal. Instead, race problems serve as an excuse for them to express their own hostility and frustrated need for power. In doing so, they actually harm black people because the activists' hostile attitude towards the white majority tends to intensify race hatred. That's something you have to really stop and think about and really listen to. And then finally, the last quote and I'll put all these links in the description of this video if you want to, replay it and do some research on your own and read some more. He was really a fascinating person. It's unfortunate, the victims that died due to his bombs. There was 3 victims, but it's also unfortunate what happened to him as a kid. You can't forget he was a kid. But here is the final quote I'm going to share with you guys. It says, "It would be better to dump the whole stinking system and take the consequences." I wonder what Elon Musk would say about that. Hey, Mandy. Hey, Jay Leo. Good to see you. Oh, gosh. I know. I don't even want to dive into 9/11. Oh, I know. I used to have like this whole different view on it, Jay. And I was like, oh, our government, back I would never do anything to hurt us. No. I can't get into that because I have like a friend of mine that passed away in one of the World Trade Towers. And that shit pisses me off because I guess I was very naive to it. But let's move into our next story. This is going to be the man who died in the ADX. So like I said, Ted did not. He died in a hospital in Virginia. He was moved there in late 2021. He was 81 years old when he passed away. And we don't know. We don't know any details on, if it was old age, if he was ill, if he had cancer. We're not sure. When are these from? So this was from his manifesto, the Manifesto, which was published in 1996, I believe. It's called Industrial Society and Its Future, and it was published, 1995. First published January 1st of 1995. 35,000 word essay. Crazy town. He is a very smart individual. So let's talk.
She said, we came home, we planted flowers.
And if you would like to donate to the stream, you can do so at www.j4j411.live. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the stream. I enjoy bringing this stuff to you, and peace out.
You and your problems, I don't give a damn. You talk way too much, I have heard enough about you and your problems. I don't give a damn. 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 I don't give a damn.
Yikes.
Like, what the fuck is this? And everybody's like, what the fuck is this?
Okay! Meow. Meow.
Eddie, what have you done for me lately?
Oh my God. God forbid, one comment.
Is what, one Jennifer or two Jennifers?
Bye, Jennifer.